Let's talk about some basic definitions of evolution. The word evolution literally just means change. For example, a child evolves into an adult. But in biology, and regarding the origin of the species, it has two very distinctly different meanings. First, there is microevolution, which simply means change within an existing species. Examples would involve things like different hair color, skin color, or eye color, any of which could actually help a species adapt to changing circumstances. In fact, it's an amazing ability to help species survive. It's basically what it is change within an existing DNA code that exists within the species. And Darwin actually used this to talk about survival of the fittest. And in fact, even biology textbooks will often talk about microevolution. But the key is the DNA structure already exists. It just allows variations within that cell structure. It has nothing to do with a frog turning into a hamster or an ape turning into a human being. The second area is called macroevolution. Now, this is the theory of one reproducing species randomly changing into another totally different reproducing species. An example here might be a fish turning into a lizard, and again, an ape to a man. But this theory would indicate that humans' original ancestors really came from just a single cell that was able to subdivide into two cells and eventually was able to turn through a great parade of changes into a human being. In this series, we're going to use the word evolution to talk about macroevolution because that's the way it's generally used in the world. Let's take a quick look at the history of this debate between creation and evolution. It might shed some light on why people think the way they do today. Most people don't realize that it wasn't until the mid-1800s that most of the world's greatest scientists accepted the Bible as absolute fact. Now, this includes Sir Isaac Newton, perhaps the world's greatest physicist. His physical laws were even used later to try to disprove parts of the Bible. But yet Newton was still one of the world's greatest supporters of Genesis and of the Bible. Perhaps he realized that he didn't have a microscopic view, or he didn't have a view of the heavenly realm. And it's this information that has caused great revelations that help us understand that the Bible is true. But it wasn't only Newton. There were many, many other great scientists who firmly believed and supported the Bible. The list is enormous. People like Kepler, Galileo, people like Pasteur, the father of modern medicine, and the list goes on and on. So what caused this rift between science and theologians? Well, in the mid-1800s, two things happened that started to create some problems. Number one, of course, was the original book Darwin wrote called Origin of the Species. The second thing that happened about the same time was a new concept or idea called the higher criticism of the Bible that really scrutinized in a different way the Bible's reliability. Now, Darwin's theory lacked a lot of things at the time. There were very few fossils available, and it certainly lacked modern scientific knowledge we have today. Higher criticism of the Bible was without modern archaeology. Archaeology was very young then. As a result, biblical scholars lost a very highly publicized debate. This is the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925. This debate placed famous orator William Jennings Bryan, representing the Bible, against a very skilled defense attorney, Clarence Darrow. Now, using a very clever argument, Darrow forced Bryan to conclude that Genesis may be wrong. His logic used in his argument, we know today to be completely wrong. One of the key arguments was that science believed at that time that the universe was infinite. The debate had far-reaching impact. Christians were regarded as prejudiced, uninformed, and ignorant. And this whole emphasis on infinite time, thought correct by scientists then, created two fierce battles. Battle number one, Christians versus science. Christians started to believe that they needed to agree on a, quote, time of creation. This created another problem, battle number two, Christians versus Christians. Since scientific evidence seems to point to an Earth created millions of years ago, one group of Christians started analyzing the Bible and believes that the Earth was created only about 10,000 years ago. It's called the young Earth view. The other group of Christians believe that the Earth is millions of years old. Now, both of these views are consistent with the original Hebrew of the Bible, as we'll be discussing in a minute. Unfortunately, this issue of time of creation arose only because science had so little understanding of the universe in 1925. Today, we know the universe had a beginning, just as Genesis 1 states. And we'll show later that even 15 billion years, which sounds like a lot to us, is not nearly enough time to randomly produce even a single living cell. Stephen Hawking, one of the most brilliant scientists since Einstein, teaches one of the most accepted theories of the origin of the universe. In his book, A Brief History of Time, he describes how he thinks the universe evolved. In a fraction of a second, he says, unknown quantum physics developed subatomic particles known as quarks and antiquarks. In another fraction of a second, these particles formed protons and neutrons, the basis, of course, for atoms. The protons and neutrons binded together to form common elements like hydrogen, all in about 1 second. Within about 3 minutes, all matter and radiation were coupled together. Then, over 300,000 years, electrons bind with nuclei, and the universe becomes transparent to the cosmic background radiation. The next 1,000 million years create stars and galaxies and quasars. When these are present, solar systems form that create living matter. To start with, let's take the age of the universe. Now, I'm not going to argue about a young Earth, old Earth viewpoint. Let's take the most conservative viewpoint from a numbers sense. Let's assume that the universe might be in the neighborhood of 13, 15 billion years old, which would be at the outside edge of what most scientists believe. And in fact, the latest space technology actually confirms that that is the probable, at least from a scientific viewpoint, probable age of the universe. Now, this equates to about 10 to the 17th power seconds. That means basically 10 with 17 zeros. Now, secondly, let's consider the amount of matter in the universe. Matter are particles, things, substance, if you will. The smallest particle, we all know that matter is made up of molecules, molecules by atoms, and atoms by subparticles. Well, if we were to say a baryon, which would be like a proton, would be the smallest particle of matter in the universe, scientists have calculated, again, through a lot of our recent technology, a maximum of about 10 to the 84th power number of baryons, or tiny little particles that would exist in the universe. Then let's consider the number of conceivable interactions of these particles with each other. What we're driving at here is what is the chance of these things randomly coming together over time to form something so complex as a reproductive cell? Well, scientists believe that the maximum number of interactions between these subatomic particles would be 10 to the 20th power. In other words, 10 with 20 zeros, essentially, per second. That's 10 to the 20th power interactions per second. Finally, let's take the number of events required to randomly produce a living cell. And again, we're getting back to some of the great research done by Harold Morowitz. Biochemists have calculated this to be 10 to the 100 billionth power of interactions. That's how many interactions would be necessary to create the very first simplest living cell. Let me repeat that number. It's such a vast number, again, that some computers have a hard time even dealing with this number. It's 10 to the 100th billionth power. That's a huge, huge number. Okay, so let's see what this means in mathematical and probabilistic terms. What we're looking at first is the maximum possible number of atomic particle interactions that could have occurred. If you take the total amount of time, we talked about that, 10 to the 17th, times the total amount of particles in the universe, maximum, 10 to the 84th, times the maximum number of events per second, 10 to the 20th power, that equals a total possible number of interactions in the universe since the beginning of time of 10 to the 121st power. So you can look at the probability of evolution by taking the total possible number of interactions and dividing that by the number of interactions necessary to realistically create the first reproductive cell. So if you take 10 to the 121st power and you divide it by 10 to the 100 billionth power, that equals basically 1 over a huge, huge number. Any mathematician would look at that number and say, well, that number is simple. That number is 0. So mathematically and probabilistically, you can literally prove, literally verify, there was just not enough time, not enough matter, not enough space for even the very first living cell to have ever occurred on Earth. And this is something that has staggering implications. That's why when science learned that time and space had a beginning, it doesn't matter if you're a young Earth viewpoint person and looking at a 10,000-year-old Earth. It doesn't matter if you're looking at 15 billion years. And I could show you the same mathematics. It doesn't matter if it's 30 or 100 billion years. No matter what number you choose within any reason at all, there is just not enough time, matter, and space and interactions to possibly, conceivably, put this structure together to begin with. Let me tell you 2 stories about my watch here. Now, nothing really fancy about this watch, but as you'll be able to see, it's a combination analog and digital watch. And the first story is this. The first story deals with how this watch was created. Now, there was a project director from Japan. His name was Nomo, and he started several years ago with a team of engineers that created detailed engineering drawings for every little component in this watch. calculations obviously had to be made to size all of the different gears that created the analog mechanism, to calibrate the timing mechanisms, and to create the integrated circuits for the part of the digital display. But in the end, what did they have? Well, really what they had was just an attractive ornament. It wasn't really a timepiece yet. And in fact, it didn't serve any purpose until somebody wound the watch up. Then it became a timepiece. Now I'm going to tell you story number 2 about how this watch evolved. You see, billions of years ago, the Earth was really much more favorable to manufacturing than it is today. There was a sea of ooze that surrounded the Earth, and the sea of ooze just happened to have all the right little elements in it that were needed for this watch. It had little teeny pieces of metal, and it had little teeny pieces of the silica that would eventually make the crystal, and little bitty pieces of paint that were all floating around in this ooze. And there was volcanic heat at the time, and over a process of a real long period of time, this volcanic heat made these particles of metal bond together. And as they continued to tumble in this ooze over billions and billions of years, a few of these pieces of metal started to form these highly precision gears, and it was very fortunate that they just happened to be exactly the right size necessary to create a timepiece. Then you had really kind of an incredibly beautiful little ornament. It just lacked one problem. It still needed somebody to wind it. Now, which of those 2 stories do you believe? The idea of evolution of a watch seems absurd. At least I would hope so. A single living cell is so vastly more intricate than this simple little timepiece. So much more complex than a simple watch. It's beyond comprehension. Just think about a few things. Watches don't reproduce. They don't diagnose themselves or heal themselves. They don't think. They don't create. The list goes on and on and on. So why do we laugh at some story of an evolved watch and teach evolution of a far more complex living cell? Do you know the human cell is far more complex than the most advanced manufacturing facility in the world? Now, in Darwin's time, Darwin and other scientists, such as David Hume, regarded cells as just blobs of protoplasm. They really didn't understand how they work. Today, we can look inside these cells. We know how incredibly complex these cells are. If you take a single cell, its size would be much, much smaller than the period at the end of a sentence in a typical book. Yet, this single cell, so tiny, is far more complex than the most modern factory in terms of the functions that it performs. Put another way, so vast is the information routinely managed by only one human body that scientists have calculated what it would be if it were written in books, in tightly spaced books. And what they calculated was the number of books it would take to cover that amount of information of one human body routinely managed would fill the entire Grand Canyon. But that's not the end of the story. It would not only fill the Grand Canyon, it would fill it 50 times over. Just the information routinely managed in one human being. Evolution assumes a change of many complicated events over billions and billions of years, events that require very highly complex changes. Just the steps of development of DNA alone. This is a very insurmountable problem for evolution. To keep it simple, all the DNA and RNA required of all life is a highly complex chain of events. Now, the chain of events in and of itself is very, very complex, but if you take that chain, just the development of that chain, you would find that it's statistically impossible without input from an intelligent designer. Another huge problem is that the amino acids that bond with nucleotides, hundreds at a time in a chain, yet the entire chain of each must have the same orientation of that amino acid. It's called either being right-handed or left-handed. Now, this sounds very complex, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but let me give you a very simple analogy. What would it take to randomly produce one single DNA molecule? First, DNA defines the traits and characteristics of humans. Let's assume that a computer randomly typed letters on a page until it perfectly spelled out characteristics of a human being. That alone would probably take forever. In other words, just random letters being typed until you get a perfect description of a human being on a page. Let's just assume each word on the page had to be spelled correctly with perfect punctuation. That makes it harder to conceive because now we're looking at not only perfect information, but it had to be spelled perfectly and it had to be perfectly punctuated, all by a random computer. Now let's take the simplest aspect of what would have to happen in this building of a DNA chain. Let's assume that this random computer had a 50% chance of either typing a letter right side up or upside down. Now just take that simple idea and let's assume now that it doesn't matter what it wrote. It could type out anything on a page. No punctuation, no spelling. The words don't have to be right. It's just getting one page of all upright letters. How long, at a page a second, how long do you think it would take for a computer to type that page? Well, it's very easy to calculate it. If you figure 5,000 letters on a page, it would be like randomly flipping 5,000 heads in a row. Well, at a second a page, the answer is it would take 10 billion years just to randomly type all upright letters on a page. But the complexity of the DNA molecule is so much more staggering than that. You would not only have to print one page of all upright letters, but it would also have to spell out perfect characteristics, and it would have to be spelled perfectly and punctuated perfectly. And not only would you have to type one page, you would have to type 500,000 pages just to form one DNA molecule. Let me describe it another way. Imagine each amino acid could either be flipped heads or tails. To work, all amino acids in a chain must be the same. In other words, all of hundreds must be, quote, flipped heads for that one single molecule. Of course, expanding this into an entire creature, you were talking about many thousands of consecutive coins being flipped heads, something that is statistically absurd. Secondly, amino acids first form into short chains. If you imagine each amino acid component as a letter, the evolutionist would imagine a scenario that would require a computer randomly producing letters that become meaningful words. And don't forget, they still have to be all flipped heads first. Thirdly, the short chains of amino acids bond into longer chains. Picture words becoming sentences, and they have to make sense. A sentence of words randomly thrown together would usually not make sense. Now let's take that simple first step. Amino acids have to have the correct orientation. Again, like flipping heads many times in a row. If you were to consider only the number of correct flips, disregarding the words, disregarding the sentences that also have to make sense, the DNA information within a human being would make up about 500,000 pages with 5,000 letters per page. Now let me put this in perspective. If we were to imagine atoms randomly coming together to form DNA, just to get one single page of the correct orientation of amino acids would require 5,000 flips of heads in a row. Now, suppose evolution could flip a coin 5,000 times a second. That's a lot of times a second. It would still take 10 billion years just to get a single upright page of letters. But keep in mind, this is a simple example. It is a small part of the problem. We need 500,000 of these pages of upright letters, or flips of heads. Now, that's a simpler way to understand the complexity, but getting into this in great detail, there are many books on this subject that you can get into great detail on this, but the bottom line is we couldn't form that first DNA molecule, let alone form a first living cell. Now, observation involves several types of things. We can observe things of the past, like fossils. We can observe things that are happening at the current time, such as mutations of various creatures. And we can even speculate on things through observable experiments. Let's take fossils. Now, Darwin himself was convinced that fossils would eventually produce concrete evidence of his theories of evolution. He thought that digging up bones would eventually reveal transitional species. Understand that in Darwin's day, very few fossils existed at all. But today, we have millions and millions and millions of fossils. Fossils provide some very strong evidence of creation. Scientists recently discovered that many life forms somehow appeared suddenly in a very short period of time. And it sounds just like the Genesis account. It's called the Cambrian explosion. Microbiologists have strong evidence against the simplest evolutionary changes occurring over billions of years. Now let's take the area of mutations. With the electron microscope, we discovered that species could be defined with DNA. Because of that, there has to be a change in DNA for a species to evolve from one species to another. So, evolutionists have come up with a theory of mutation. After all, we've all seen pictures of deformed animals or Siamese twins. The theory was proposed that through a series of positive mutations caused a very fortunate evolutionary change. But mutational changes are almost always destructive. They do not advance species. Secondly, mutations are not inherited. Siamese twins don't run in families. Mutations are caused by external events and are entirely different than genetic tendencies. Let's just suppose that we could create the exact molecules and cell structure for life. And let's further suppose that we could put them all in the right place perfectly to form a human body. You know, we would have essentially the equivalent of a dead body. Take a dead body. Presumably, after something dies, we could then repair it with the right parts and bring it back to life. We can't. It's like the intuition example. Someone still needs to wind the watch. Maybe you've seen some of the wonderful, dramatic photographs from the Hubble Space Telescope, or seen, the Kobe satellite passing Jupiter, or some of these wonderful photographs and things from the planet of Mars. So let's talk about cosmology, because we're really in an era. The Bible talks about a tremendous increase in information at the end of the age, and we are certainly, if you were to look at a curve of the amount of information we have right now, you will find that it's dramatically increased in a very, very short period of time. And perhaps nowhere as much as the area of cosmology, or the study of the heavens. Now, for 100 years, great intellects have been trying to use cosmology, or the study of the heavens, to actually prove that God doesn't exist. Well, now we know that this has really backfired. Starting in about the 1940s and again dramatically increasing, especially in the 1990s, science is confirming the Bible like never before. Not only does the proof of a creator exist, it actually matches exactly the account that's given in the Bible. First, let's consider some new facts. We know that the Hubble telescope, it was ironic in a way that when we had the first problems with the Hubble telescope, instead of looking at near things, because it basically had what we would call blurry vision or out of focus camera, but when you get out to very long focal lengths, it makes little difference. So what happened was we did some of the experiments of the edges of the universe before we did some of the closer in experiments, which required fixing the Hubble telescope. But what that did, in combination with this Kobe space satellite or explorer, what it did was it helped us confirm, again, general relativity. It also gave us a view for the first time of the actual edges of the universe. In fact, some of the world's greatest scientists have when they heard this news, we had Ted Koppel talking about it on TV, and Stephen Hawking, and many, Carlos Frank, and many of the top scientists were saying, in effect, this is almost like looking at God, is the way it was positioned. Unfortunately, the world seemed to not get it in general. It didn't. Even though at first it was front page news in some major newspapers across the world, on TV, the general public didn't respond the way I wish they did. Now, why didn't they respond? Well, one, these are concepts that are difficult to understand, even for many scientists. If you're not a physicist, and physics is one of the most detailed and maybe difficult areas of science, it would be very difficult to understand the concept of general relativity, for example. For example, who can conceive of the beginning of time and space? It's difficult, I think, for all of us in some way. Number two, it's hard to accept. If we really know that there was a beginning and a creator of the universe, many people don't want to believe that they might be accountable to something for eternity or something else, perhaps a God of the universe. So there's resistance not only from a difficult and an intellectual standpoint, there's also a resistance from an emotional standpoint. It's sometimes more convenient just not to believe. Science and the study of the planets has gone much further. We now know that there are billions of stars, and even billions of galaxies. We also suspect that there are billions of planets. We don't know this. And of course, you've read a lot recently or heard a lot recently of discovery of planets. A lot of that has been proven untrue, but let's not argue that point. Let's assume maybe there are billions of planets. But do billions of planets mean that there's another Earth out there? The more you study Earth and the critical parameters necessary for life on Earth, the more you can easily become convinced that there is absolutely no chance, or almost no chance, of another Earth existing. Every single year in the past 10 years, we have learned many more criteria that are absolutely critical for life on Earth. We find finely tuned details about planet Earth that absolutely could not have occurred by mere chance. Some of them are obvious. The distance of the Earth from the Sun, obviously very important in terms of determining the heat. The time of the rotation of the Earth is important for things like gestation, for, again, for the amount of heat in certain parts of the planet. Some other factors are much less obvious. The ratio of oxygen to nitrogen is critical. The tilt of the planet Earth is critical. Things you never think about. The size of the moon is critical. The fact that we have one moon, not more than one moon, is critical. There are many, many little details that, again, would take a long time to go through. And most of these, in fact, we now know that the list extends to over 60 finely tuned criteria of planet Earth that are necessary for life. 60. And many of these, if you vary them by just a few percent, a single change in any one of these by a few percentage points would make it virtually impossible for life to exist on Earth. Again, if you run through the calculations, it's very easy to understand that the odds of another planet Earth are virtually zero. Now, science is going to continue to expand in this area, and it's going to be an exciting one to get into. But you'll find there are so many little things that you'll never think about that are vital to our survival. Things that you think of as being destructive: earthquakes, volcanoes. You think of these as being terribly destructive, but they play a very key role in life on Earth. Thunderstorms, the discharge of lightning, all of these are finely tuned in the balance. The amount of land in the northern hemisphere versus the amount of land in the southern hemisphere, the ratio of land to water, all of these play a vital part that we've learned through cosmology is a very important point to allowing for life on Earth. And it's, again, just another aspect of evidence of the miraculous and finely tuned design of a creator. You know, I frequently get asked by people, what are the chances of life on other planets? Now, we've talked about how highly improbable, virtually impossible it is that we would even have another planet like Earth. But, of course, we get the media bringing us attention of this Mars rock that came and supposedly had some evidence of life from Mars. I want to talk about that just for a second because I think it's important for people to understand. First of all, it would not be a surprise to astrophysicists to eventually find evidence of life on Mars or even several other planets in our solar system. But we're not talking about little green men here. We're talking about life forms that actually traveled from Earth to other planets. Let me explain. Since about 1960, scientists have realized that tiny microbes of life exist around our planet in the highermost parts of our atmosphere. And these tiny little microbes, extremely small, a micron or a tenth of a micron or less than that, very, very small in the upper areas of our atmosphere, are swept away by what's called a solar wind. A solar wind is basically, you may have heard the word photons. They are photons from the sun that are constantly bombarding our planet, and they're powerful enough, and the gravity up there is weak enough because these are little tiny, tiny specks. They're sweeping these specks of life away to other planets. So almost on a daily basis, we are actually transporting through the solar wind life from planet Earth to other planets. And secondly, we've done calculations that have confirmed that if we had a meteor strike the Earth that would be large enough to create a 60-mile crater on Earth, and there have been a few of those in the past. Obviously, they don't happen on an annual basis by any means. It's something that's very, very rare. But the calculations show that if a meteor of that size struck the Earth, it would be powerful to launch boulders into outer space that would strike other planets. We found that you can calculate that a certain number would be pulled into the gravity of Venus. Other rocks would even reach Mercury and Mars and Jupiter, and possibly even one or a few, very few, to Saturn. And calculations have confirmed all of this, of course, depending where the Earth was in its travel around the solar system at that point in time. And obviously, if such rocks had embedded in them forms of life, whether it be in the form of fossils or even live life of microscopic type or whatever, these rocks containing some evidence of life could reach other planets. And again, it would be from Earth. You know, physics is an amazing area of science that offers incredible support for creation. The first thing we need to do is put in perspective physics of 100 years ago or a few hundred years ago versus what we know today. Now, when Galileo was playing with billiard balls and others with apples, what we were doing was basically defining laws of motion or physics within things that we could see and feel and touch and calculate, which things that deal with the naked eye. Now we can get into areas that are a lot more complex than that. In fact, with Einstein, with quantum physics, with many new tools we have now, we're able to delve deeper not only into the atoms themselves, but also, of course, deeper into the heavens, into outer space. Now, Newtonian physics still applies within the tangible world that we're used to dealing with. What Einstein did was basically define it in a much more complete way. What he did was he basically provided us equations that can help us understand both the universe as a whole and also atoms and the way they behave. And it definitely is very clearly in support of the Bible, much more clearly in support of the Bible than Newtonian physics. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of technical equations here, but I want to talk about one very important thing, and that is what used to be called the theory of general relativity. I say used to be called that because when Einstein first developed this theory, he was only confident we could only test it to a level of about a 90% degree of accuracy. Now we can test this theory to a level of 99.999, I think 26 decimal places of precision, which means that it is essentially fact. Why is this important? What general relativity defines in the most basic sense is it basically says that there was a beginning of time and a beginning of space. Again, this is a hard concept for most human beings to conceive of. A beginning of time, beginning of space. It's not difficult for the astrophysicist, it's not difficult for the mathematician, but it's difficult for most of us. But yet it's been verified by many experiments and by many different equations. In fact, Einstein himself tried to find a way around his own theory by including a constant into his equation. And the reason he tried that was he was trying to exclude God, because he realized himself that if in fact his equations were accurate, what it meant, it implied that there was a beginning of time, a beginning of space, and that implied, of course, a beginner or a creator. But by the time Einstein died, he fully acknowledged that his attempt to exclude God from the equation was one of the biggest mistakes of his professional career. He eventually accepted the notion that there had to be some kind of creator. That doesn't mean Einstein had a personal relationship with God, but at least he acknowledged that a God must have existed. Let me talk about another area of physics, the area of thermodynamics. There are two basic laws that most people, or at least some people, are familiar with. The first law of thermodynamics, which basically says that no matter or energy can be created, it just can be converted from one to the other. And the other one, the second law of thermodynamics, is the law of entropy, which basically, this offers very strong support for creation. Remember the watch example? How inconceivable it is that intricate gears and the mechanism of a watch could tumble and ooze and not wear out and somehow become more and more precise. Well, the second law of thermodynamics actually deals with that type of a problem. Things have a tendency to wear down. Things become more disorganized, like someone's desk, not more complex. It takes purposeful energy to organize your desk or to polish gears on a watch to the precision that it takes to work at all. Evolution denies this basic law because what it does is it assumes random luck somehow makes things better and better and more organized. Yet there's no evidence of that happening in our universe without some purposeful design or purposeful input of energy. In fact, all laws of physics are consistent with the biblical account. You'll find many places in the Bible where it refers to the beginning of time. So the Bible offers a lot of evidence now that we didn't understand at the time, but now with the benefit of some of the equations of Einstein, plus all of the corroboration that we've had from other experiments, we've come to realize that these biblical words were right all along. Now, if we're going to discuss creation, we need to think about how do miracles happen and how can we understand this creation miracle. The word miracle is, in a way, it's an oxymoron. It implies something happened that we could perceive as being impossible, or at least from our perspective. Our perspective changes as we look deeper into molecules and further into outer space. But the thing we can't do on this earth is look beyond our constraints of time or the three dimensions of space, height, width, and depth. Many of the scientific field have actually looked into different areas of dimensionality, and in quantum physics have actually even defined areas of dimensions that are beyond those that we know. But for most of us, it's very difficult to conceive of this. How can we as humans conceive of no time? How can we conceive of no space? It seems like there had to be a beginning of time, but it also seems there couldn't have been a beginning of time. And space seems to be endless, although it almost seems like there has to be an ending. Science has defined now and determined that time and space both had a beginning, exactly as it's stated in Genesis 1:1. We'll talk more about that later. But first, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of dimensionality. And one way to understand dimensions beyond the ones we know are to consider dimensions beneath the ones we know. In other words, it's a lot easier for us to look at 3 dimensions and try to imagine a world in 2 dimensions and understand how miracles can happen in that world. Let me introduce you to what I call flatland. Flatland will be, for purposes of this example, will be this tabletop. It's flat, it's 2-dimensional. Now, imagine that I've created this world flatland, and I've created many types of creatures. And I want to introduce you to, here, a couple I've cut out. This is Mr. Flat, and here's another creature that I created, and we'll call it Mrs. Flat. And I can place these people in flatland, okay, and I can also I could cut out little fish, I could cut out birds, I could cut out all kinds of creatures and place them in this imaginary land called flatland. Now, how would Mr. and Mrs. Flat view each other? Well, to each other, they would really just look as a line, a single line. They wouldn't be able to have nearly the view that I have looking down on them. And if they want to learn more about each other, they kind of need to walk around each other, and they can get some kind of a concept of what they really are, but they can't really see the total picture the way I can. So, what would be a flatland miracle? Suppose I say a group of flatlanders was growing very, very hungry. If I wanted to, I could cut out a bunch of little fish and I could just suddenly plop down a lot of little fish in flatland. They would miraculously appear. They would have no idea how I'm doing it, but I know because I exist in 3 dimensions. In 2 dimensions, coming one down one dimension, it would seem to be a miracle. Now, let's suppose I made another space that existed in 3 dimensions. We'll call these, the top of this set of books, 3-dimensional heaven. Now, these people in flatland can't see this area called heaven. But as the creator of flatland, I can do several things. Number one, if I want to insert myself in flatland, it's pretty easy. I just stick my finger down, and people will see what? They'll see a line. Or if I want to stick 3 fingers down, what will they see? They'll see 3 lines. So what do you know? Mr. Flat over here sees 1 line, and he says, I understand God. He's a line. This Mrs. Flat over here will see 3 and say, no, you're wrong. I see God, and God's 3 lines. But yet they have no concept of what I really am, which is, of course, a lot more than just a line or 3 lines. But if I wanted to create a miracle and transport one of these flatland people into my imaginary heaven, all I need to do is lift them up and place them in this new dimension. Yet someone down here has no concept whatsoever of what this other dimension is. Now, obviously, this whole object or this example of flatland is an extremely elementary example, and it doesn't address a lot of issues. But what it does do is help us realize that we are limited by dimensions of space and time. And to consider miracles, one should consider the very distinct possibility that science seems to support these days, that there are dimensions far beyond the ones that we live in. Let's talk about something that people sometimes fail to consider, and that is the source of the Bible's account of creation as itself, because it's the Bible. Now, in order to talk about this, we need to establish why should we believe the Bible in the first place. Did you know that the Bible contains 667 historical prophecies that have virtually all been confirmed to have happened? 667. Now, some of these prophecies were long-term prophecies, some were short-term prophecies, but many were extremely specific. For example, prophecies included the naming of Cyrus, the king of Persia, hundreds of years before he was even born, as the king that would eventually cause the temple in Jerusalem to be rebuilt hundreds of years before the temple was even destroyed. That's pretty incredible. Naming the person, naming the events, and naming what was going to happen. Precise prophecies actually define the exact day that Jesus would enter Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. This day was defined hundreds of years before Christ. The list of prophecies in the Bible is enormous and absolutely mind-boggling. I could spend hours just talking about precise prophecies of times, of places, of events, of people. It really clearly reveals the inspiration of the Bible from God. Bible also contains many scientific insights, insights that were entirely correct thousands of years before science knew the facts. These insights are in areas of medicine, engineering. We've already named a few, the beginning of time, things that people just totally didn't understand until modern science. In fact, if you were to look at a list of some 40 or 50 scientific insights in the Bible, you would find that virtually none of them were discovered until at least 1,000 to 2,000 years later by science. Yet every single reference to science in the Bible is 100% accurate. And of course, the Bible is not a textbook on science, but because it's inspired by God, one would expect it to be accurate. An important one of these scientific insights is creation itself. Now, with all the other facts and prophecies in the Bible being accurate, it would seem we should carefully consider the creation account, even if it differed from what science thought, just because of all these other facts that have been shown to be true. But the truth of the matter is, the account of creation in the Bible totally agrees with the sequence of events of creation according to science today. Now, if some of you want to take a Bible out and turn to Genesis 1, I'd like to review some of the important insights. Someone with a scientific mind will immediately be struck by two very important items. The first, of course, we have the statement of initial conditions. And if you look in your Bible, you will find that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. This is an initial conditions, state of conditions that a scientist will relate to. When you do an experiment, you always want to start with a set of initial conditions. Secondly, the Bible gives you a frame of reference. You will find, again, in the first chapter of Genesis, God's Spirit was hovering over the surface of the waters, or some Bibles will say of the deep. But what that's telling you is the frame of reference from which to read Genesis is not some God out in the cosmos someplace, but it's a God whose Spirit is right at the surface of the waters. So this reference point will make all of the rest of the events of creation make sense, especially to a scientist. And third, I want to re-emphasize that the purpose of the Bible is not a science textbook. It was not to give us all the intimate details of creation. What it was the Bible is to deal with events that are significant to man. It also shows how God is involved with man, that he had a purposeful methodology in how he put things together. But the purpose of the Bible, of course, was not to give us a science textbook. You could have a textbook much bigger than the entire Bible doing nothing but talking about the events of creation. God's purpose was simple. How does creation affect man, and who was the master of creation? Just for a basis for understanding, I'd like to talk just a second about the basis for the young earth, old earth Christian conflict. The conflict is really rooted in the Hebrew words for day and the Hebrew words for morning and evening as translated in Genesis. See, biblical Hebrew really had only about 3,000 commonly used words, which of course is far, far fewer than the number of words we commonly use in the English language today. The Hebrew word for day is the word Yom, as in Yom Kippur. And what that meant usually was a literal 24-hour day, and hence it was translated as such in our modern Bibles. Yet it could also have meant a defined period of time, or an era, much like we might say in the day of the knights of old or something like that. Now, at the time of Moses, there was no suitable word to mean defined period of time other than Yom. So while young earth supporters will argue Yom meant a literal 24-hour day, old earth would argue that it was in fact a long defined period of time. There is really no other word that they could use. But don't let this young earth, old earth debate pull you off the track of the central issue, which is creation universe is evolution. The God of the universe could have easily worked either within the laws of physics, which would be reflected in the scientific record, or God could have transcended the laws of physics. Well, if we're going to take a look at the Bible as a source of authority for creation, which of course I believe we should, especially after reviewing the points about the incredible evidence of the accuracy of the Bible, what we need to do is take a look at the steps of creation in the Bible. And essentially there are 10 steps of creation listed in the Bible that actually agree precisely with science as we know it today. Let's talk about step 1. Step 1 is pretty basic. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. The darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The heavenly bodies here were being created, and the initial conditions were that the earth was formless and void of creatures and that sort of thing. And of course, this precisely agrees with what science feels was the original condition of the earth. Now, did God do this through some big bang or some other process? It really doesn't matter. It could have been through a big bang, or he could have just created it. That is not the issue. Let's move to step 2. Step 2 is in Genesis 1:3. And it says, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." This would seem to be a contradiction or a problem for scientists, because a scientist might say, well, wait a minute, if the heavens and the earth were created on the first day, are we saying here that all these stars and everything didn't have any light? Well, you have to consider again the frame of reference. God's Spirit was hovering over the surface of the waters. And then it starts to make perfect sense to a scientist, because most scientists would agree that the initial conditions of the earth was covered by very dense, dark gases that would not have allowed light to penetrate to the surface of the waters. So through some process that's not explained in the Bible, I think scientists might even differ on exactly how it happened, but through some process, the Earth's very dense, dark atmosphere was made to be translucent, so at least enough light could come to the surface of the Earth to allow for such important things as photosynthesis and that sort of thing. Step 3 is in Genesis 1:6. Let's take a quick look at that now. "And God said, 'Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water.'" What does that mean? To separate water from water. What this essentially is referring to is the development of the hydrologic cycle, or the water cycle. With light now reaching the surface of the deep, it allows for water to evaporate and create the clouds, which is the separation of the water above and the water below. This, of course, to a scientist, this is extremely important. This hydrological cycle, or water cycle, is a vital part of the ability to support the life that was to come next. Okay, step 4 is Genesis 1:9. Let's just read it real briefly. "And God said, 'Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let the dry ground appear.' And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered water he called seas. God saw that it was good." Well, to a scientist that studies the formation of the earth, they would be in total agreement. What scientists will say is that at this point in the Earth's history, there was a tremendous amount of seismic, earthquake type of activity, volcanic activity, which basically allowed the land to rise above the waters and separated the waters from the land. And the important thing is that land was required for man. It might be interesting to note that scientists have actually calculated that the ratio of land to water on the Earth is the precise ratio that would allow for the maximum amount of life forms on a planet like Earth. So even down to details, and I could go through a number of other ones, it's amazing to me the precision of each of these steps and how it meets the needs of what God's intention was. Step 5. You'll find step 5 in Genesis 1:11. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to the various kinds." And it was so. The creation of vegetation during this third day or third period could only occur, of course, with light reaching the surface of the Earth and with plenty of carbon dioxide on the Earth, which scientists again know was a very major component of the Earth's early atmosphere. Plants, of course, have to breathe carbon dioxide in order to survive. By the way, I want to point out that if you read through the Bible and you say, there's a step missing. We don't have the dinosaurs mentioned in Genesis, or we don't have this, or we don't have that. Keep in mind, God's purpose in telling us the story of creation isn't to give us a science textbook. You could write a whole book on any one of these areas. But his purpose was to show that creation was purposeful, that he did it, and to describe the steps and how they would relate to man. So most of the animals and vegetation and things that you find listed in Genesis are animals, vegetation, things that are important to man for one reason or another. Let's move on to step 6. Step 6 you can find in Genesis 1:14. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark the seasons and the days and the years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on earth." And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. Think about it for a second from a scientific point of view. We've talked about how we have basically we have light coming through this translucent atmosphere. We have plants now that are taking in carbon dioxide. What do they produce? They produce oxygen. Oxygen, of course, is a vital element necessary for any of the creatures that are going to be breathing oxygen, like man. Interestingly, oxygen also is one of the factors of helping create a transparent atmosphere like we have today. So that suddenly we're able to see through the atmosphere, and we're able to see the stars in the heavens and the great lights of the sun and the moon, which previously in a translucent atmosphere would be barely visible, and of course the star is probably not visible at all. So essentially, this step 6, agrees with what science would agree happened once you consider God's Spirit hovering over the surface of the deep. Modern translations seem to imply that the sun and the moon and the stars were created that day. However, this is where you need to go back to the original Hebrew in the Bible, because as we said earlier in this series, sometimes Hebrew words had to be used because there weren't other words that could be used, and sometimes there is a misunderstanding in modern translation. If you examine the original Hebrew in the Bible, you'll find that it does not use the word bara. Bara in Hebrew means to create out of nothing. Now in Genesis 1:1, creation of the heavens and the earth, bara is used. And bara is used in the creation of man and other events of creation. However, on day 4, the word bara is not used. On day 4, the original Hebrew words could have meant made, as in the past tense, or could have meant made to appear. Obviously, if in God's process oxygen was making the atmosphere more transparent, then the sun, moon, and stars would have been made to appear on the surface of the earth, which is where God's Spirit was hovering. And of course, this was what allowed the value that's discussed in this chapter to man. The value here is to mark the seasons and day and night and that sort of thing. So it's important to understand that even though we have modern translations that might be a little bit misleading, that to really understand exactly what the Bible is telling us, we need to be open to the original Hebrew words that were used. Step 7 is in Genesis 1:20. Let me just read it briefly. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to his kind. And God saw that it was good. What we're talking about here is, again, whether it's a 24-hour day or a long period of time, as scientists would believe and old Earth would believe, is the creation of small sea animals and the birds, and not necessarily in that order. It's just basically in that period of time. That's when these are created. Now, all of the animals discussed in the Bible are those that were important to man. Let's move on to step 8, Genesis 1:24. Let me briefly read that. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. It also is interesting to me that the Bible is very clear that these animals and creatures are creating according to their kind. What that says is, it's not saying they evolved from one to another. They basically were created in a class in and of themselves, which of course now with DNA research, we know basically what these kinds are, how we can define these kinds through DNA and through their ability to reproduce. Let's move to step 9. Step 9 is in Genesis 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let him rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." Verse 27 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him." So here we have the Bible finally talking about the creation of man. Again, I want to emphasize the word bara is used here, created out of nothing. In other words, there was no pre-existing ape that he turned into a man. He created man out of nothing. An important point to realize is that man is defined in the Bible as having a spiritual relationship with God. Only man was created to worship God, which you find in many places within the Bible. Step 10. That actually occurs in Genesis 2:2. Let me read that briefly. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing, and so on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. At the time of Moses, there was no culture on earth that had any idea of how planets developed, or the world, or creatures on the earth. No one had this information that we know today. But somehow, Moses happened to know these steps. That's a miracle in and of itself, that even someone would know the steps, which would imply that it was divinely inspired. But for 1 minute, let's assume that all of today's science existed back then, except that Moses just had to guess the order of the 10 events of creation. In other words, let's say that science knew all this stuff, and Moses was given the challenge, "Okay, Moses, guess from 1 to 10 how creation happened." Well, just for Moses to properly guess the correct order of the 10 events described, assuming he knew them, would be equivalent to winning a state lottery. And of course that assumes that he knew the events to begin with. If we randomly evolved from other life forms, in a sense, we are really no different than animals. It would imply that there is no God that purposely created us. And if we have no God and no purpose, it leads to the idea of no absolute authority. How do we define right and wrong? How do we define good and bad? Have you ever heard the phrase, "I have to do what's right for me," or a phrase, "If it feels good, do it"? But what was right for Hitler was not right for the world. Many things that, quote, feel good can lead to problems. Things like sexual diseases or drug problems or family breakups. Before evolution, the Bible was generally regarded as the ultimate authority and the standard. It was often not followed, of course, but at least it required a willful rejection of an accepted authority. Now, if evolution is true, there is no God involved with people, and there is no God to help us with our daily problems, and there is no hope for life after death. But if creation, especially the biblical account of creation, is true, then God is an available source of strength for today, and some will spend an eternity in a paradise called heaven, yet some will spend an eternity in the horror called hell. Therefore, the consequences of the truth of this issue are enormous. It would be utterly foolish not to take time to investigate the evidence. As we've seen, there is so much overwhelming evidence supporting creation. It makes one ask, why is there this great debate of creation versus evolution? Well, there are really three reasons. The first is ignorance. If you don't know the facts, if you don't know this new information, how are you going to make an informed decision on which is right? And frankly, most of the world, even most of the scientific world today, is just unaware of the facts. Keep in mind, we're talking about many things that have happened over the last few years. And even scientists that are very knowledgeable in one area often are not knowledgeable in other areas that have a very important bearing on this system or this idea of origins. The second is the continual propensity of people to have old-fashioned thinking. As we saw in our discussion of history, there were several key debates that Christians lost, not because the truth was not on their side. They lost the debates because science wasn't smart enough to know the answers at that point in time. So they lost debates based on faulty assumptions. A lot of this old historical thinking still exists in the minds of many people today. The third reason people reject creation is perhaps the saddest of all, and that's apathy. Frankly, some people insist on rejecting the idea of a supernatural God at all costs. Now, we can correct ignorance with knowledge. We can correct misconception of history with facts. But it's difficult to change the thinking that really comes from someone's heart. Someone who's determined to reject the possibility of a God, no matter how strong the evidence is. Now, in summary, we've looked at a lot of things in this series. We've looked at virtually all areas of science. We have found every single one, bar none, supports creation. We've examined facts that have come forth to us in just the last few years. The challenge to us now is to get these facts out into the world so that the common person knows these facts. And that's the purpose of this series. We hope that what we have presented you through these new findings and through this whole series of information you can use to teach your own family, to become knowledgeable yourself, to tell your friends. There is overwhelming evidence for creation, the creation exactly as laid out in the Bible. Now it's up to us to help tell the rest of the world.
Continue viewing for a special video appendix for advanced study, including such topics as an analysis of the naturalist presupposition in science, an explanation of William Dembski's explanatory filter to detect intelligent design, a study of the optical purity of amino acids and natural mechanisms for DNA assembly, an explanation and analysis of chaos theory as a naturalist self-organizational scenario, and an analysis of Boswell interpretation and homology.
Science historians have chronicled for us the kinds of questions which scientists have been asking of science throughout history. They also chronicle for us a vast paradigm shift in the metaphysical paradigm or worldview within which science has been functioning, which took its roots in the early Enlightenment, was fiercely fueled in the age of Darwin, and came to its culmination in the end of the 20th century. This new paradigm is called naturalism. More specifically, anti-supernaturalistic, or a type of monistic naturalism. We can define this naturalism as a belief that the universe, or nature, is the only reality. It is eternal, self-activating, self-existent, self-contained, self-dependent, self-operating, and self-explanatory. The universe is not derived from nor dependent upon any supernatural or transcendent being or entities. It may also be defined as a belief that all phenomena can be explained in terms of the inherent relationships of natural events without recourse to any supernatural or supernatural explanation. So in other words, a belief that no reality exists other than processes in space and time. There are no non-natural causes. This is important to our discussion because limiting paradigms, such as a metaphysical paradigm, limit the kinds of questions and answers which are available through an investigative process. As an example of this, years ago in Chicago there was a murder trial which was considered an open and shut case because the abandoned murder weapon with the suspect's fingerprints on it had been found. And yet, through a legal technicality, the defense attorneys were able to dismiss the murder weapon as evidence. By doing so, they limited the kinds of questions which could be asked. And by limiting the questions, they were able to guarantee the answers and guarantee the outcome and an innocent verdict to the trial. In the same way, in science, a metaphysical limitation in paradigm, or the kind of questions which could be asked, guarantee the kinds of answers which could be obtained. So we understand that when we hear claims such as all scientific evidence points to evolution, what's actually being said is that when we restrict our questions to those limited by naturalism, the answer which is forced is evolution. Now, this isn't how science has always operated. Science used to function under what is called a system of free inquiry. Free inquiry systems allow multiple hypotheses to compete to see which has the most explanatory power given all of the evidence. Now, many scientists have tried to defend the shift to a presupposition of naturalism, which limits the questions and guarantees the answers before the investigation, by arguing that only paradigms of naturalism allow the intersubjectivity desired in science. Now, intersubjectivity simply argues, or simply means, that any scientist doing the same experiment, given the same constraints, would come up with the same answers. Thereby, it's been argued that credibility happens to a scientific idea through multiple processes of experimentation. Now, these scientists argue that issues of design, which are allowable and possible in systems of free inquiry, are intuitive and purely subjective. that no two scientists would see the design in the same place. Therefore, they argue that because of its lack of intersubjectivity, which is critical in science, therefore a presupposition of naturalism is more practical and useful in any kind of empirical, objective endeavor. But this lies in stark contrast to the writings of many leading evolutionists. Richard Dawkins, a Darwinian evolutionist, writes, "Biology is the study of complicated things which give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." But this begs the question of why it's only an appearance and not actual design. And the answer lies solely in the presupposition of naturalism. And yet the claim is contradicted here because even an evolutionist sees objectively the appearance of the design, ruled out only by the presupposition of naturalism. Biologist Francis Crick writes, "Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved." Why would this biologist be confronted constantly with issues of design if design is an intuitive, subjective process? But again, the objective nature of the design is apparent and ruled out clearly only by the presupposition of the naturalist paradigm. This can be best illustrated in the rhetoric jargon that many try to argue when they argue the difference and separation of religious ideas and science. Take a look here at what was written in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. They wrote to their constituents, "In any confrontation, you should be prepared to show that evolution is scientific, not that it is correct. One need not discuss fossils, intermediate forms, or probabilities of mutation. These are incidental. The question is, what is science and what is religion? Therefore, if you must confront the creationist, we suggest you discuss the nature of science, the kind of knowledge it can provide, and the kind it cannot provide." Notice here clearly they're arguing from the metaphysical presupposed paradigm of naturalism. They presuppose that only questions arguing from nature and evolution are true. Therefore, if it is an argument of design, regardless of the evidence, regardless of the theory, if it's outside the realm of the presupposition, they don't consider it science and remove it from the argumentation. Rhetoric, jargon, but not evidence. Now this has been argued and has taken hold only because until recently no one has been able to argue a definition or defined an empirical objective process to recognize actual design. This changed recently only in the last decade when William Dembski wrote his work, The Design Inference. Bill Dembski provides us with a filter which is capable of recognizing the characteristics of designed objects. The filter, called the explanatory filter, examines an object in light of the possible explanations to account for its existence. These explanations are law, chance, law-constrained chance, and design. We'll examine these individually. The first mode of explanation is law, and the example Bill Dembski gives of this is gravity. Whenever two objects of mass approach one another, gravity naturally occurs as a predictable event. Therefore, if something is explained by gravity, then design, although possibly present, is not a necessary inference. The second part, or second mode of explanation, is that of pure random chance. And for an example here, he gives radioactive decay, or the rate of radioactive decay. It's not a law-governed predictive rate, but it's purely random chance. If something can be explained by pure chance, then again, design, although possibly present, is not a necessary inference. But if it's not explained purely by chance, then what we have is a high degree of complexity. We understand degrees of complexity as directly relational to degrees of improbability. Thus, something as complex or improbable as a long sequence of coin flips can still be generated randomly. However, we eventually reach a point of improbability where our imaginations must be constrained and explanations beyond just that of chance are required. But then Bill Dembski's explanatory filter doesn't then point yet to design, but then asks what else can constrain this chance to cause it to go beyond and have sufficient complexity. And since the theories of Darwin, a new mode of explanation has entered, and that of law-constrained chance as an explanatory phenomenon. An example which is given of this is that of an agitator. For example, a pure chance agitator would be, let's say, a barrel with different sized stones which is shaken in space. Without the constraining law of gravity, the large and small stones would equally be bouncing inside the barrel. But under the constraint of gravity, if we were to bring that barrel low and shake it, the rocks would stratify by size and weight. In this type of explanation, what we have is a type of complexity which is explainable by random chance, the agitator, governed by some type of law, constrained by some type of law, which is gravity. Constrained chance is also the explanatory theory used by exponents of Darwinism, where mutations are considered events of pure random chance, which are then constrained or selectively guided through the law of natural selection. These exponents claim that such constrained chance can then give us the appearance of design and purpose when it does not actually exist. Now, if we have sufficient complexity that is not explainable by either constrained chance or by chance, then we have design. And the key to recognizing the distinction between constrained chance and actual design is what is called specified complexity. In order to explain how specified complexity helps us to recognize design objects, such as a violin, take a look at this example of license plates from a 1997 Corvette. Our first license plate reads BXC 382. As we examine the complexity of this license plate, we find a moderate to fairly high improbability, or complexity, about 1 chance in 13 million of arriving at this plate. But there's no specification. This license plate is the result of a primarily random process. But the fact that this car was given this plate at this time is purely random chance. So we have pure chance involved here. Now let's look at the second plate, GRY 815. Now this license plate has the exact same complexity as the one previous, but we begin to see something right away, a type of specification. Now this is still, we would be argued at this point, non-specified complexity. But because the letters GRY represent gray, and they point to a target, a color, something which is known, the color gray, which is on the car, we begin to argue some type of specification. Not sufficient to argue design, but just to give you an example of what specified complexity is. Now, at this point, we would still argue this is pure chance. But if we increase the specificity, we increase the design. For example, if we were to say that this person who owns the car bought this car on his birthday, and his birth date is August 15th, thereby 815. Now we have a greater specificity. Not enough to demand design, but enough to warrant and see the difference. Or if we were to say, this is this person's 815th Corvette, then we could argue again, greater specificity. But again, the complexity is the same. The specificity is changing. Let's look at the third plate. This one reads GRY VET, Gray Vet. Now we begin to have not only greater complexity, in this case 191 million to 1, but we have begun to introduce high specificity. And finally, the fourth license plate we'll look at, 97 Vet. Here we have extremely high specificity and even greater yet complexity. In this case, with 2 numbers and 5 letters, we are over 796 million to 1. But what makes the great difference is not just the high complexity, but the extreme specificity which accompanies it. Now, the explanatory filter in design theory argues that specified complexity is a reliable empirical marker of actual design. There are 4 reasons why specified complexity has been demonstrated to be a reliable empirical marker of actual design. First, in every case where the filter yields design and we know the causal story, and intelligence was active. We'll note here that what this filter has proven to us is that information comes from intelligence. Some try to argue at this point that design is a God of the gaps argument. We're arguing things we don't understand, therefore we put design and supernatural events in. But we're actually arguing not what we don't understand, but what we actually do know. And what we do know is that information always, without exception, comes from intelligence. That's what intelligence does. It creates information. The second reason why we know this is a reliable marker is that the filter pinpoints exactly what it is about intelligences that makes them detectable. Third, the filter recognizes specified complexity. And fourth, can specified complexity be generated without design? And the answer, there are no confirmed counterexamples. Here's where the theory is clearly falsifiable, where there's a scientific program, any evolutionist, naturalist that wants to argue against it is only to produce counterexamples where specified complexity is generated without intelligent design. Now, some have tried to argue granite crystals or mixed polymers, but this is simply complexity in order, but not specified complexity. For example, crystals of granite lack complexity, and mixed polymers lack specificity. They fail as specified complexity. There is a profound difference between order and information. Order, such as that found in crystals, is simply a set of repeated patterns. For example, a set of letters ordered like the order of a crystal might read ACFD, 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 and so on in a repetitive but ordered pattern. Order actually works contrary to information because order breeds repetition, and repetition works contrary to information. You'll note that in an information-bearing sequence of letters, such as the cow jumped over the moon, we have specific placement of letters based on information. However, there is no order. In fact, if you were not able to understand the information in the sequence, you would find absolutely no rational sequencing in the order of letters whatsoever. From here, we'll take a specific look at an example of specified complexity in biology that was brought up in the video. The first would be that of the optical period of amino acids, and the second, that of the information or assembling of DNA. And then we'll let two competing hypotheses, one of law-constrained chance, chaos theory, and that of design, function, and see whether chaos theory actually takes the evidence and has any explanatory power beyond that of design. In order to understand the weight of the argument of the optical purity of amino acids as a design argument, it's first important to understand the nature of an isomer. Isomers are simply chemically identical mirror images. This first molecule is built with what we'll call atoms A, B, C, and D. Its isomer is also built with the atoms A, B, C, and D. Notice here how the correspondence between the atoms and the relationship between them is the same. In each isomer, A is next to B, corresponds to C, corresponds to D, all corresponding to the carbon atom the same way, except they lay reversed, and therefore they can't superimpose one another. Now, what's important to understand is that nothing in natural chemistry can identify or recognize the difference between isomers. Also, whenever isomers are formed in nature, they're formed in what is called a racemic mixture. 50% of one type of the isomer, 50% of the other type of the isomer. Now, depending on which way the atoms rotate, we label these either L isomers or D isomers. So we'll call these L amino acids and D amino acids. Now, in life, only L amino acids are used, and Ds are toxic to life. So the question arises, if nature produces 50% of L's and D's together at all times, and yet life was formed with a collection of just the L amino acids, what occurred in order for the L's to be separated from the D's so that D's not only are not used in life, but are actually toxic to the information found in life? As an illustration of how isomers work, consider two puzzles which are cut from the identically same die, so that the corresponding pieces from both puzzles are shaped identically the same, but the pictures on them are different. Now the illustration here is that the puzzle pieces are isomers and that the pictures on them are the differences in the rotation of the atoms. But nature is a blind puzzle builder, so it would be the same as taking the puzzles, breaking them into their respective pieces and mixing the two puzzles together, so that we'd have a racemic mixture of the two puzzles, like a racemic mixture of isomers. But then rebuilding the puzzles blindfolded, so that you would be blind to the actual differences, which would be the pictures on the puzzles. You could structurally put the puzzles together, but you'd never be able to recognize that there was a wrong and right piece for each location in each puzzle. So you'd build the puzzle with both pictures in it. In the same way, nature, being blind to the difference between isomers, would build the puzzles of isomers using both L and D forms. So we would expect life to have both the L and D forms of isomers, and yet the puzzles in nature have been made using just the L forms. So in other words, nature is a blind puzzle builder and yet contains perfect puzzles. The most popular naturalist theory argues that the answers to this evolutionary conundrum are found in space. This theory is offered because we know that circularly polarized ultraviolet light is known to be able to decompose selectively either the L or D forms of amino acids. We also know that light from stars, as they pass through charged particles of dust, can be circularly polarized. So the theory states that amino acids, either traveling through space or while on Earth, were bathed with circularly polarized ultraviolet light, which then created an excess of one or the other isomer. In this case, we'd say an excess of L isomers. Life then began on Earth with a disproportionate amount of L's to D's. Then the theory states that some sort of auto-multiplication process occurred in which life automatically purified itself, so that it continued to replicate itself, removing D amino acids until life had only L amino acids formed. This argument is based on some research which was done at the University of Tokyo on the autoreplication and purification of isomeric molecules. Now, researchers at Tokyo found one isolated molecule in nature which has the ability, when created with a small enantiomeric excess, to auto-replicate and purify itself to about a 99% purity of the isomer which was in excess. So the theories of biological autopurification are based upon this research as foundational evidence. However, there are many reasons why the University of Tokyo research is foundationally irrelevant to the optical purity of amino acids. First, the only biological relevance of the experiments at Tokyo is that an amino acid is used as a catalyst in the process. The actual subject molecule which autopurified is pyrimidal alkanol. Second, the results with this pyrimidal alkanol have been limited to pyrimidine 5-carbaldehyde, a biologically non-useful carbon atom. And third, the actual process of autopurification is a laboratory-induced result that requires purposeful stimulus with particular specifications. As the parameters of these particular specifications narrow, the amount of complexity and specification increases. Thus, rather than provide a working, natural explanation, it only increases the markers of specified complexity. Other theories, or other problems which confront the space theory, again, is that the circularly polarized light can only create a small enantiomeric excess. So again, what we have on Earth is a pure life form, pure amino acids of one type. Other theories that are offered is that life began racemically, with both L and D amino acids in it, and a process on Earth purified it. But again, the theory is based in sole conjecture. It's a theory which is trying to argue naturalism because of the presupposition of naturalism. It's ignoring all evidence which states that there is nothing in nature which can do the purification process in an amino acid. So what we have then in the complexity of amino acids is a very specific complexity, a complexity which points to life, which is necessary for life, which is unexplained by constrained law. Although some try to explain it, again, we'll look at chaos theory in just a moment. It's unexplained by constrained law, and yet exists and provides a specific purpose. So we have a specified complexity, And I would argue that the specified complexity then is a clear actual marker of design. The next step we would take from the optical period of amino acids is the information actually found in DNA. Let's discuss momentarily first what information is. How do we recognize information? Information, first of all, isn't found in constituents. Information is found in the arrangement of constituents. You may think of an alphabet, or the letters T, C, and A. T, C, and A alone, the constituents provide no information, but in the order CAT, they do provide information, cat, or feline. So we understand that information is contained in the sequence-specific arrangement of constituents. Second, information is a non-material entity. For example, think of a floppy disk. If I held a floppy disk and it was empty, there was no information on it, and I weighed it, and then took it and filled it to the maximum with information from my computer and weighed it again, the weight difference would be negligible. There'd be no change. And yet, I would have, in the case of a floppy disk, 1.4 megabytes of information stored in the disk. Again, all that happened is that the constituents on the floppy disk were reordered in order to provide and store information. Knowing this, then, that information is a non-material entity, then how do we explain the information we find in DNA? Now, what we have in DNA, which makes information, is sequence specificity. So the sequencing of constituents provides information. And in this case, it's the sequencing of nucleotides. The order of nucleotides in a DNA chain is what provides the blueprints, which carry information, which order and direct the ordering of life and the creation of life. Now, in order to try to explain this naturalistically, naturalist presuppositional scientists have argued what's called a self-organizational scenario, or some scenario where law-constrained chance was sufficient to order and constrain the nucleotides in order to cause them to be in the right order to provide information. But this type of theory fell critically apart upon the discovery that there is no critical chemical bonding between nucleotides in their sequencing order. The chemical bonding is solely, or the critical bonding is solely, between the nucleotide and the spine of the DNA. The illustration given of this is the magnetic letters that children play with on refrigerators. The chemical attraction, or the natural attraction, is between the magnet and the refrigerator. So if a child were to write on a refrigerator with his letters C-A-T, cat, or I-N-F-O-R-M-A-T-I-O-N, information, we would know that the chemical properties, or the natural law properties, are between the magnet, the letter, and the refrigerator, not in the order in which the letters are placed in the fridge. In fact, nothing can influence the order except the child, the intelligence of the child writing and placing the information on the fridge. Dr. Francis Crick likened these to typeset, letters on a typeset. Just as in old typeset printing, the typeset would have a block, and it'd have a letter imprinted on the block, and then the printer would take those typesets, place them on his printer, and press them down on a page. Amino acids work the same way. The spine of the amino acid is the only place where chemical bonding occurs. So that along these spines of the amino acid, which are all chemically identical, we have a corresponding binding. But the information isn't in the binding part of the amino acid. It's in the side chain of the amino acid. Whereas the side chain would be considered the same as the imprinted letter onto the typeset block. So that if you put the typeset block properly into the typesetter machine, it's simply a square block. It doesn't govern what letter goes where. In the same way, in an amino acid chain, what governs where the amino acids bind is simply the spine. But no information is carried in the spine. The information is carried in the side chains. And then the sequence specificity of the amino acid side chains, the order in which they go, is where the information of life is found. And there is no governing chemical attraction which dictates which amino acid goes in what sequence. That information is not found in any kind of critical chemical bonding. It's not required by any kind of critical chemical bonding, and yet it exists as specified complexity, which again is a clear pointer, an empirical marker to actual design. So then again, what we're arguing here is a system of free inquiry, a competing hypotheses, best explanatory model system. So here are our four models of explanation. First, we have the explanation of necessity. Second, we have the explanation of chance. Third, we have the explanation of chance and necessity, or law-modified chance. And fourth, we have the explanation of intelligent design. We've seen that chance is insufficient to explain the complexity in DNA. We find that law is insufficient because there's no critical chemical bonding between the nucleotides, and natural chemistry can't separate amino acid isomers. We find that constrained chance, or chance modified by law, also fails. Remember that in evolutionary theory, natural selection is the constraining law. However, natural selection cannot function without a complex reproducing system. At this point in biogenesis, a reproducing system doesn't exist. Natural selection is therefore a non-starter and an unavailable answer. There is no natural law that can constrain the informational sequencing of nucleotides in biogenesis. Therefore, what we have here, again, design theory, comes across as the best hypothesis with the most explanatory power, taking all of the evidence. Specified complexity, a clear marker of intelligent agency. So we'll take an examination now also of chaos theory, because chaos theory is the alternate self-organizational scenario which is offered. In order to better understand chaos theory, take a look at the placement of pitches from this pitching machine. From the batter's perspective, there would seem to be an unpredictable randomness to the location of the pitches. But are the pitches actually random, or could they be predicted given perfect knowledge of the initial conditions? For example, if we were to know the texture of the ball, the exact speed of the wheel spinning on the machine, the exact voltage and amperage to the machine, the density of the air through which the ball must pass, any breezes or winds, the amount of contact between the ball and the wheel, the amount of friction between the ball and the wheel, the temperature of the ball and the machine, and so on through many, many other initial conditions which govern the flight of the ball. If these were perfectly knowable and predictable, then theoretically, the outcome could be absolutely predictable and would not be random. So the randomness is apparent based upon the limits of our knowledge. And accordingly, the closer we get to the pitching machine, the greater the ability to predict the location of the pitch, because the causal variations are yet minimal. Notice how in this case, it's exact, just looking through the camera. So then chaos theory is defined as effectively unpredictable, long-time behavior arising in a deterministic, dynamical system because of sensitivity to initial conditions. So then chaos tries to explain design by dealing with it as determined outcomes of specific initial conditions which are established by chance. In applying this to biogenesis then, chaos theory teaches that the initial conditions of the Big Bang were such that biogenesis was completely determined or unavoidable, even forced. But there are many critical problems in applying chaos theory to biogenesis or to life. The first is just one of esoteric or mysterious, impossible knowledge. Proponents of chaos theory believe that the initial conditions of the Big Bang were significantly influential to have subsequently progressively fine-tuned the Big Bang in such a way so as to produce a galaxy and a solar system and the life-supporting planet, to then populate that planet with optically purified amino acid isomers, and then to structure and organize these isomers in order to form information, which is then compiled in blueprints as DNA to form life. The application of chaos theory adds nothing in the way of producing a mechanism of explanation to the assembling of genetic information on Earth. It's simply a theory of faith in nature, fueled by the need to produce a theory of biogenesis based in naturalism. It's necessary to question why chaos theory should be accepted on the basis of such faith, when design theory has been established on the basis of the evidence. Second, chaos theory doesn't solve our problem of probability. Again, if we have just one universe, for we now know or are confident that our universe will not recollapse, this is one shot, one universe. Again, what is the probability that all these highly unstable initial conditions of the Big Bang would come together in such a way that they would subsequently force life to occur? They are so impossible that most physicists and scientists also regard these as unreal and have new theories to explain them. For instance, Stanford physicist Andre Lin has developed the chaotic inflationary model. He believes that the first universe caused quantum fluctuations in other fractals, and so it branched out like a family tree and caused more universes. And each of those Big Bangs, as they began, caused other fractal universes into this ad infinitum exponential equation of family trees of universes. So that he would argue that there are incountable, infinite amounts of universes, and we're just one of these. And out of all these infinite universes, then only one needed to have the right initial conditions for life. So then he's trying to explain away the problem of probability. But again, there's no proof. This is all hypothetical conjecture, first. And secondly, in a conference named Science and the Spiritual Quest, Andre Lin himself confessed that his theory doesn't solve the problem of the first Big Bang. Where did the first universe come from? And he said this doesn't solve the problem of creation, only pushes it back to infinite past where we can no longer study it. In this final section of the appendix, we'll be discussing how theory and information is used to apply meaning to evidence. Evidence by itself is simply artifact. It carries no weight. It tells no story. It lends no support for either one theory or the other. Theory and information are applied